past Sunday, my 90-year-old grandpa was diagnosed with pneumonia. The doctor sent him home on antibiotics to rest and recover. But 2 days later, he received a negative COVID 19 test result. And since he didn't have to worry about making anyone else sick, he went right back to work. He owns a little service station, and I know he considers his job essential. How many 90-year-old men do you know that still go to work every day? He's been going there 6 days a week for 70 years. Some people might think it's about time for him to retire, but I know he never will. In fact, he'll never even get old. I know one day he'll be gone, but as long as he's here, he'll be living his life to the fullest. And I know this because it's part of our family story. And that story is multi generational. My grandpa's great 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 grandpa was named Samuel Ensign. Samuel was over 80 years old and still showing up to work every day. His work was building the Salt Lake Temple. Now, Samuel was very engaging, and he entertained the much younger workers with his stories of the adventures he would take his wife on. He also belonged to something called the Old Folks Excursion Society. Samuel did not intend to grow up. He never intended to get old. He would tell these stories while sitting on top of the temple, where his job was to hoist framework and then wind up the slack rope. The foreman had long since given up on telling him that he was too old to be there. Surely he had done his duty, but he would have none of it. The day he died, he lost his footing and fell over 90 feet. I imagine Samuel died with a smile on his face. And why do I imagine this? Because I understand my family's story. Samuel never got old. He lived life to the fullest, to the very last breath. And in the end, he had an incredible story to tell. Now, there's the circumstances of our life, the facts, the things that everyone in the whole world would agree with. And then there's the story of our life. It's the way we interpret those facts, the meaning we give to our experience. It's how we make sense of it all. Each one of us tells a story of our lives. We tell it intentionally or by default, consciously or unconsciously. And the way we tell that story really affects how we show up in the world. Our individual stories contain many parts, some more useful than others. But if we were to distill it all down into just one sentence, like the headline of a newspaper article, we'd get a really good sense of the story's trajectory. We'd get a really good sense about how someone experiences their own life. It's so interesting to me how we look through the Book of Mormon and see the different characters telling their own story, and how that story, like my family's story about living life to the fullest and never getting old, how it transfers from one generation to the next. Nephi tells the story of his life as though he's a hero. He shares the circumstances of his life. Often they are impossible sounding. And then he shares how he handles them with courage and faith. Think about his account of going back to get the plates, or of his broken bow, or of building the ship. We think Nephi is just reporting the news, but really he's conveying his story, his perspective of what happened, of what he experienced. And he experienced it that way because of the way he was thinking about it. It would have been equally valid for him to see his life as though it were like super hard, with so much being asked of him. But that is not the sense we get at all when reading his own account of his life. I think Nephi, if he were to write his own newspaper heading to an article about his life, would say something along the lines of, "I will go and do." Now, on the flip side, we see the way his older brothers, Laman and Lemuel, tell the story of their lives. We read that they believed they had been wronged, driven out of the land of Jerusalem, wronged in the wilderness, wronged while crossing the sea, wronged in the land of their first inheritance. They had the rightful ruling taken out of their hands and the records stolen from them. The newspaper heading of their life would probably be something along the lines of, "We were wronged." So this last week in Come Follow Me, our family tried to see things from Laman and Lemuel's perspective. And as it turns out, when we really considered it, we could see where they were coming from. In fact, our oldest Jane said, "I get them. I've wanted to beat my brothers plenty of times." She shared how it isn't exactly easy being the oldest. You've got inexperienced parents, and you have all these expectations that you don't really feel like you're living up to. Her perspective was so interesting. Laman and Lemuel really did try. We can see it in the story. They didn't have to do anything. They were adults and could make their own choices, but they left Jerusalem with their father. They went back for the plates. They helped build the ship with some extra encouragement. They did the best they could, but somewhere along the way, they began to believe that they had been wronged. And the brain is an amazing thing. It always finds plenty of evidence for whatever we believe. This is true for all of our beliefs, by the way. It's called confirmation bias, which means it's very important that we choose what to believe consciously and intentionally because we will prove it true. Laman and Lemuel believed they had been wronged. They found lots of evidence to support this belief. And while our family could definitely see their perspective, we could also see the result of their self told story, and it wasn't useful. It was totally disempowering to them and to their children and to their children's children who still believed and found evidence for that belief. The result was that they victimized themselves over and over again. I have so much compassion for Laman and Lemuel. I have felt wronged before. I felt like a victim. It's very natural when we experience circumstances that are outside of our control to feel like a victim. And when we feel like a victim, we start looking for villains, and the brain will find them. That primitive part of our brain likes being in the victim role because it conserves energy for us. It keeps us safe inside the cave. We don't have to show up in our own lives and make things happen. But the truth is that telling a victim story never serves us. It causes us to stay stuck. One way to tell if our story is empowering or disempowering is to ask this question. Now, my husband loves grammar. It's a funny thing to love, in my opinion, but he's always asking us questions related to grammar. In this case, am I the subject or the object in my own story? Am I the actor or am I being acted upon? Acting like Nephi in his story or being acted upon like Laman and Lemuel in theirs? Do I think more about what's happening to me or more about what I'm doing, what I'm creating, what I'm becoming? Now, I want to point out here that there are plenty of people who we would all agree have been wronged. And yet, when we're in that situation, what we choose to do with that experience, what we choose to make it mean, and how we put it into our story will either empower or disempower us. I love the words of Viktor Frankl. He said, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's own attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." Frankl made this incredible observation, and he made it as a prisoner in a German concentration camp. His mother was killed, and his wife was also killed. If anyone could tell a victim story, Viktor Frankl could, and yet he took his power back. He focused on what choices he had available to him. He focused on being who he wanted, no matter what was happening around him. In a situation where it seems like he had very few choices, he chose his own attitude. He chose his own story. Jesus Christ is always the perfect example. And in this situation, it's especially true. Think about it. He lived a sinless, perfect life, and yet he was plotted against. He was ridiculed. He was mocked. He was forsaken by his friends. He was falsely accused. He was beaten and crucified. And yet he never considered himself a victim. In every single situation, Jesus Christ chose who he wanted to be. He chose to forgive. He chose to love. He chose to submit to the will of the Father. He chose to trust God's plan. No matter the circumstance, he kept his power. I think of his self-possessed demeanor during his trial. His words to Pilate are very telling. "To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world." He did not give his power away, not once. And in the end, he wasn't killed, but instead gave up the ghost and commended his spirit into the hands of his Father. Jesus Christ never told his own story from a place of victimhood. It was part of his life experience, but not part of his definition of himself. I think that's a very important distinction. I pondered this week on what the Savior might title the newspaper headline of his own life. My guess is that it would be both a summation and an invitation, something along the lines of, "Be of good cheer. I have overcome the world." So powerful. It has definitely been worth my time this week to ponder how I currently tell my own story. Am I the object or the subject? The actor or the one being acted upon? Does my story serve me? Does it empower me? I have been so blessed by the way my ancestors told the story of their lives. And while my children and my grandchildren, like every one of us, will have power to write their own story, I very much hope that the way I tell my story will be a positive influence on the way they tell theirs.